The truth is a funny thing because most people think it's a destination, but in my experience, it's more like a mirror you've been avoiding for 20 years. When people walk onto my stage, they aren't usually looking for the truth, they're looking for an ally. They want me to tell them that they've been right all along, that their pain is someone else's fault, and that if the world would just align with their perspective, everything would be fine. But that's not how life works, and it's certainly not how healing starts. I've sat across from thousands of people, and I've learned to listen not just to what they're saying, but to what they're desperately trying to hide from themselves. You see, the most dangerous lies we ever tell are the ones we tell ourselves to keep our ego intact. We build these elaborate narratives where we are the hero or the martyr, never the villain, and certainly never the cause of our own misery. I remember when Diane first walked into my dressing room before we started taping. She was a woman who radiated a very specific kind of polished exhaustion. She was dressed in a crisp navy blazer, her hair was perfectly coiffed, and she sat with a posture so rigid it looked painful. On the surface, she was the picture of a successful, grieving mother, a woman who had done everything right and yet found herself standing in the wreckage of a broken family. She had reached out to us because her 24-year-old daughter, Chloe, had completely cut her off. No phone calls, no texts, no holiday visits for 18 months. To Diane, this was an act of inexplicable cruelty. She told my producers that Chloe was unstable, influenced by a bad crowd, and suffering from a skewed reality. She wanted me to fix her daughter. She wanted me to be the hammer that would break through Chloe's defiance and force her to see reason. But as I looked at Diane, I didn't see a victim. I saw a woman who was holding on to her rightness like a life raft in a storm. I've seen that look 1,000 times. It's the look of someone who has used logic to justify emotional tyranny. She was articulate, she was prepared with a timeline of Chloe's failures, and she had a file folder full of printouts to prove that she had been a supportive mother. She was ready for a debate, not a breakthrough. And that's the first red flag. When someone comes to me with a legal brief instead of a broken heart, I know we're dealing with a deep-seated denial that's going to take more than a few platitudes to crack. I sat there listening to her rehearse her grievances, and I realized that Diane wasn't there to save her relationship with her daughter. She was there to win an argument she'd been having in her head for a decade. The problem, as Diane saw it, was Chloe's ingratitude. She talked about the private schools, the dance lessons, the college tuition she'd paid, and the countless times she'd bailed Chloe out of various emotional crises. In Diane's mind, motherhood was a ledger of transactions, and because she had invested so much, she felt entitled to a specific return on that investment. A daughter who reflected her values, followed her roadmap, and validated her choices. But Chloe had stopped playing the game. Chloe had gone no contact, a phrase Diane spat out as if it were a modern contagion. To Diane, no contact wasn't a boundary. It was an assassination of her character. She couldn't understand how a child she had poured everything into could simply choose to walk away. She called it parental alienation, even though there was no other parent in the picture to do the alienating. She was looking for a label to pathologize her daughter's distance because the alternative that the distance was a rational response to Diane's behavior was too terrifying to contemplate. As we moved onto the stage and the cameras started rolling, I watched the way Diane interacted with the space. She didn't look at the audience. She looked at the empty chair next to her, where Chloe would eventually sit. She was bracing herself for a confrontation, her jaw set, her eyes scanning for any sign of weakness she could exploit. I've lived my life studying human behavior, and one thing I know for sure is that you can't change what you don't acknowledge. Diane was acknowledging the symptoms, the silence, the anger, the estrangement, but she was completely blind to the disease. She thought she was there to put Chloe on trial, but what she didn't realize was that I was already looking at the evidence, and the evidence was written all over Diane's face. It was the tension in her hands, the way she interrupted my opening questions to clarify a point that didn't need clarifying, and the absolute lack of curiosity she had about how her daughter actually felt. When Chloe finally walked out, the atmosphere in the studio shifted instantly. The air became heavy, charged with the kind of static that only exists between two people who have spent a lifetime hurting each other. Chloe didn't look like the unstable girl Diane had described. She looked tired, guarded, and incredibly small in her seat, despite being a grown woman. She didn't look at her mother. She kept her eyes fixed on me as if I were a buffer zone between her and a predator. The contrast was striking. Diane was leaning forward, her energy aggressive and demanding. Chloe was pulled back, her arms crossed, her body language shouting for space. I started the way I always do, by trying to establish a baseline of reality. I asked Diane to tell me, in her own words, what she thought the core issue was. She didn't hesitate. She launched into a polished monologue about Chloe's rebellion, her lack of accountability, and her refusal to acknowledge the sacrifices Diane had made. It was a performance. She was speaking to me, but she was performing for the world, trying to cement her status as the long-suffering parent. Every time Chloe tried to speak, Diane would cut her off with a, "That's simply not true," or a, "Let me finish. Chloe, I'm talking." It was a masterclass in invalidation. I watched Chloe's face go from hurt to anger, and then, most tellingly, to a dull, flat numbness. That's the shutdown. It happens when a person realizes that their words have no power, that their truth will be overwritten by someone else's narrative no matter what they say. I let it go on for a few minutes because I wanted to see the pattern in real time. I wanted to see the how of their relationship. It wasn't about the what, the specific arguments, or the history. It was about the process. And the process was clear. Diane was a bulldozer and Chloe was the dirt. Diane didn't want a daughter, she wanted a mirror. She wanted someone to reflect her own perceived perfection back at her, and when Chloe started showing cracks, when Chloe started showing her own humanity and her own flaws, Diane didn't try to help her. She tried to sand those cracks down. She tried to force the mirror to be smooth again. I saw the way Diane would use concern as a weapon. She would say things like, "I only say this because I love you," or "I'm just worried about your mental state." But the subtext was always, "You are wrong, you are broken, and I am the only one who can fix you." It's a subtle form of control that's hard to pin down because it's wrapped in the language of care. But it's toxic. It's a way of stripping a person of their autonomy while claiming to be their savior. I could see Chloe flinching under the weight of it. Every loving comment from Diane was actually a brick in a wall she was building around her daughter. Finally, I held up my hand to stop Diane. The studio went silent. I looked at her, really looked at her, and I could see the cracks in her own armor. Beneath the navy blazer and the perfect hair, there was a woman who was terrified. She was terrified that if she wasn't the perfect mother, then she was nothing. She had tied her entire identity to this role. And because Chloe was failing to play her part, Diane's entire sense of self was under threat. But you can't build a healthy relationship on a foundation of fear and ego. You just can't. "Diane," I said, my voice low and steady, "you've spent the last 20 minutes telling me everything that's wrong with Chloe. You've given me a laundry list of her faults, her mistakes, and her shortcomings. You've told me why she's wrong to be angry, why she's wrong to be distant, and why she's wrong to be hurt." She nodded, her eyes bright with the expectation of my support. "Exactly, Dr. Phil. It's just so hard to watch her throw her life away like this. I hear you, I said, but I have to ask you something, and I want you to really think before you answer. I don't want the pageant answer. I want the truth. She braced herself, leaning in. How's it working for you, I asked. Being right, having all the answers, being the one who's correct in every single conflict you've ever had with your daughter. How is that working for your relationship? Because from where I'm sitting, you're right all the way to an empty house. You're right all the way to a daughter who won't even look you in the eye. So, is being right more important to you than being connected? Because you can be right or you can be in a relationship. But in this room, on this day, you don't get to be both. The silence that followed my question wasn't just quiet, it was heavy. It was the kind of silence that rings in your ears because the person across from you is frantically trying to find a way to reframe the narrative so they don't have to look at the wreckage they've caused. Diane's eyes darted around, searching for a loophole, a way to explain that she wasn't choosing to be right, she was just being accurate. But there's a massive difference between being factually correct and being emotionally intelligent. You can win every point in an argument and still lose the heart of the person you're arguing with. That's what Diane didn't understand. She thought relationships were built on logic and evidence, but they're actually built on safety and validation. And for 24 years, Chloe had never felt safe to be anything other than a reflection of her mother's expectations. I watched Diane's face soften just a fraction, the first sign that the armor was starting to crack. I didn't push her right away. I let that silence do the work. In therapy, silence is often the most powerful tool I have. It forces people to sit with the weight of their own choices. When she finally spoke, her voice was thinner, stripped of that performative authority. She whispered, I just wanted her to have a better life than I did. That's the classic justification. It's the good intention that paves the road to a very dark place. I knew there was a history there, a blueprint for this behavior that didn't start with Chloe. It started long before Diane ever held a baby in her arms. I asked Diane about her own mother, and the floodgates didn't open, they creaked. She described a childhood of benign neglect, a father who was always working and a mother who was physically present but emotionally 1,000 miles away. Diane grew up feeling invisible. To her, love was something you had to earn through achievement, through being perfect enough to finally get a glance or a nod of approval. She had internalized the idea that if you aren't being managed, you're being ignored. So when she had Chloe, she vowed she would never be like her mother. She would be involved, she would be present, she would be there for every single moment. But she didn't realize that over-involvement is just as damaging as neglect. Neglect leaves a hole. But enmeshment, this suffocating, all-consuming presence, leaves no room for a child to develop an actual self. Diane hadn't been a mother, she'd been a sculptor, and Chloe was the clay that kept refusing to hold the shape Diane wanted. Chloe finally spoke then, and her voice was a stark contrast to her mother's. It was steady, but it carried a deep, resonant sadness. She told us about the white-knuckle childhood. She described the feeling of being watched, not with love, but with a critical eye that was always looking for a flaw to correct. She remembered getting a B+ on a math test in middle school and Diane spending the entire weekend tutoring her, not because Chloe was struggling, but because a B+ was a threat to her future. She talked about the way Diane would pick out her clothes well into high school, the way she would vet her friends based on their parents' social standing, and the way every conversation eventually circled back to how Chloe's choices reflected on Diane. The escalation didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, agonizing tightening of the noose. As Chloe got older and tried to establish her own identity, Diane's concern morphed into full-blown surveillance. When Chloe went off to college, Diane didn't just call. She tracked her daughter's location via an app on her phone. She would call Chloe's dorm room if the GPS showed she was at a party after 11 p.m. She would email Chloe's professors to check on her progress without Chloe's knowledge. Diane saw this as being a dedicated parent. Chloe saw it as being a prisoner. The more Chloe pulled away, the harder Diane gripped, and the harder Diane gripped, the more Chloe felt she was suffocating. The breaking point, the moment that led to the no contact order, was a story that perfectly illustrated the pathology at work. Chloe had finally managed to move into her own apartment after graduation. She had a job, she was paying her own bills, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she was breathing. But Diane couldn't handle the distance. She showed up at the apartment building while Chloe was at work. She didn't just knock, she went to the building manager and told him that Chloe was mentally fragile and hadn't been answering her phone, and that she was gravely concerned for her safety. She played the part of the frantic mother so well that the manager gave her a key. Chloe came home to find Diane sitting on her sofa, reorganizing her kitchen cabinets. Diane had thrown away unhealthy food, rearranged the furniture because the feng shui was wrong, and was holding a journal she'd found under Chloe's mattress. When Chloe demanded she leave, Diane didn't apologize. She didn't even acknowledge that she had violated a boundary. Instead, she started crying, telling Chloe that she was ungrateful and unstable for reacting so aggressively to a mother's help. That was the day Chloe realized that there was no such thing as a boundary with her mother. There was only total submission or total escape. She chose escape. As Chloe recounted this, Diane was shaking her head, her lips pressed together. She was already formulating a rebuttal. "I saw a bottle of wine on the counter, Dr. Phil," Diane interrupted. "I was worried she was developing a problem. I was trying to save her from herself." "Stop right there," I said, pointing a finger. "You weren't trying to save her, you were trying to possess her." There's a huge difference between parental concern and trespassing. You didn't just walk into her apartment, you walked into her soul and tried to rearrange the furniture there too. You used a lie about her mental health to bypass a lock. Do you have any idea how much damage that does to a person's sense of safety in the world? Diane looked stunned. "But I'm her mother. I have a right to know she's okay." "No," I said, leaning forward. "You have a privilege to be in her life, and that privilege is earned through respect and trust. You've treated those things like they're optional. You think that because you gave her life, you own the life you gave her. But Chloe isn't a project, Diane. She's a person. And until you can see her as a separate, autonomous human being with the right to make her own mistakes and live her own life, you're never going to have a relationship with her. You're just going to have a series of restraining orders." I could see the audience reacting, the gasps, the murmurs, but I kept my eyes on Diane. I wanted her to feel the weight of what I was saying. I wanted her to see that her love had become a weapon. We were moving into the escalation phase of the interview, where the masks start to slip. Diane wasn't just the concerned mom anymore. She was being exposed as the architect of her own isolation. And Chloe wasn't just the wayward daughter, she was a woman who was fighting for her right to exist without being audited. We talked about the blame shifting that had happened in the 18 months since the apartment incident. Diane had spent that time calling every mutual acquaintance, every family member, telling them that Chloe had joined a cult or was under the influence of a controlling boyfriend. She was poisoning the well, making sure that if she couldn't have Chloe, no one else would have a positive version of her either. It was a scorched earth policy. Diane would rather her daughter be seen as broken than have the world see Diane as rejected. "Diane, do you see the pattern here?" I ask. "Every time she moves an inch away, you try to pull her back a mile. And when you can't pull her back, You try to destroy the ground she's standing on. You've made it so that the only way she can have a life is to have a life that doesn't include you. You've literally forced her to choose between her mother and her sanity. Why would you ever want to put your child in that position? Diane started to cry then. But it wasn't the poor me cry she'd used before. It was a sharper, more jagged kind of sobbing. She was starting to realize that the evidence she'd brought to prove her daughter's instability was actually evidence of her own obsession. She looked at Chloe, and for the first time that day, I didn't see judgment in her eyes. I saw a flicker of something that looked like genuine, terrifying realization, but the realization is only the beginning. The confrontation, the real deep, bone-level confrontation was still coming, and it was going to be the hardest thing Diane had ever faced. You see, when you're standing in the middle of a burning house, you don't argue about who left the stove on, you get out. But Diane was so busy trying to find the manual for the stove to prove she'd followed the instructions that she didn't even notice the roof was about to collapse on her head. I've seen this kind of psychological entrenchment before. It's a defense mechanism. If Diane admitted she was wrong about even one small thing, like entering Chloe's apartment without permission, then the whole house of cards would come tumbling down. She'd have to face the fact that she wasn't the perfect mother she'd spent 24 years pretending to be. And for someone like Diane, that realization feels like a literal death. It's the death of the ego, the death of the carefully curated identity she's presented to the world. I leaned back in my chair and looked at Chloe. She was watching her mother with a mixture of pity and terror. It's a heartbreaking thing to see a child realize that their parent is incapable of seeing them. Chloe, I said, help me understand something. When your mother tells the rest of the family that you're unstable or that you're in a cult or that you're suffering from some kind of mental break, what does that do to you? How does that change the way you move through the world? Chloe took a breath and her voice trembled. It makes me feel like I don't exist, Dr. Phil. It's like she's writing a character in a book and calling it Chloe, but that character has nothing to do with me. And the worst part is, everyone believes her because she's so convincing. She's so concerned. So when I try to tell my aunts or my cousins that I'm actually doing okay, they look at me with this look of, oh, you poor thing. You're in denial. She's robbed me of my own reputation. She's taken away my family, and then she tells me she's the only one who cares about me. It's like she's burned down my world and then offered me a candle for warmth. That's the definition of a toxic cycle. It's a form of isolation that is so subtle and so insidious that the victim often doesn't even know it's happening until they're completely cut off from everyone else. I turned back to Diane. She was already shaking her head, her rebuttal face firmly in place. I never said those things to hurt her, Diane insisted. I was seeking advice. I was asking my sisters how to handle a daughter who had completely abandoned her mother. I was the one in pain, Dr. Phil. I was the one who was left behind. Diane, I interrupted. We're not talking about your pain right now. We're talking about your behavior. You're doing it again. You're making yourself the center of the story. You're making your pain the justification for destroying her life. Now, I want to ask you the question that I think is at the heart of this entire mess. This is the question that exposes whether you're actually here to save this relationship or if you're just here to win an Emmy for Best Grieving Mother. The audience went still. Diane gripped the arms of her chair, her knuckles white. She looked like she was preparing for a physical blow. If I could prove to you, I began, my voice slow and deliberate, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that every single thing you have done in the name of helping Chloe the tracking, the intrusive visits, the phone calls to her boss, the stories you told the family, if I could prove that all of it has actually caused her deep, lasting trauma and is the direct reason she hasn't spoken to you in 18 months, would you want to know? Or would you rather stay right and stay alone? She opened her mouth to speak, to give me the pageant answer about how she just loves her daughter, but I held up my hand. Think before you answer, Diane, because if you say, yes, I want to know, then you have to listen to the rest of what I have to say without defending yourself. You have to sit in the discomfort of being the person who hurt her. You have to stop being the victim and start being the perpetrator of this estrangement. Are you ready to be the bad guy in your own story if it means getting your daughter back? Or is your image more important than her heart? She sat there frozen. I could see the gears turning. This was the crossroads. Most people can't do it. Most people would rather die in their rightness than live in the truth of their own flaws. It's too painful. It requires a level of humility that a lot of folks just haven't developed. They've spent so long building up these walls of justification that they don't even know who they are without them. Diane looked at Chloe, then back at me. Her eyes were wet, and for the first time, she didn't look like she was performing. She looked small. I don't want to be alone, she whispered. That's not what I asked. I said, keeping the pressure on, I didn't ask if you were lonely. I asked if you were willing to be wrong. Are you willing to admit that your love has been a form of control? Are you willing to acknowledge that the help you offered was actually a way of keeping her under your thumb? Because you can't fix what you won't name. You got to name it to claim it, Diane. And what you've been doing isn't mothering. It's stalking with a smile. The word stalking hit her like a physical force. She recoiled, her face flushing a deep, angry red. That's a horrible thing to say. I'm her mother. A mother is a role, Diane, not a license to violate someone's human rights, I countered. You've used that title as a shield to protect yourself from the consequences of your actions. You think that because you gave birth to her, you have a lifetime pass to override her boundaries. But let me tell you something. A boundary isn't a wall to keep people out. It's a gate that tells people how to come in. Chloe has been trying to show you the gate for years, and you've just been trying to drive a truck through the wall. Why are you so afraid of her being independent? What happens to Diane if Chloe is okay on her own? That was the question that really peeled back the layers. If Chloe was successful, happy, and independent, then Diane's job was over. And if her job was over, she had to face the emptiness of her own life. She had to face the fact that she hadn't nurtured any other part of herself. She wasn't a friend, she wasn't a hobbyist, she wasn't a partner, she was just the mother. And she was a mother who didn't know how to let go. I turned to the audience for a moment. This is what we call narcissistic enmeshment, I explained. It's not necessarily that Diane is a narcissist in the clinical sense, but she's using Chloe to regulate her own. When Chloe does well, Diane feels good. When Chloe pulls away, Diane feels like she's disappearing. So she attacks Chloe's independence to save herself. It's a survival strategy, but it's a parasitic one. It requires the host, in this case Chloe, to remain weakened so the parent can feel strong. Chloe was nodding so hard she was crying. That's it. She choked out. That's exactly it. Whenever I have a win at work, she finds a way to tell me why it's not that great or how I'm going to lose it. It's like she can't handle me being okay without her. Because if you're okay without her, she's irrelevant, I said. And to Diane, irrelevance is worse than death. I looked back at Diane. She was sobbing now, her head in her hands. The navy blazer version of her was gone. She looked broken. This is the part of the show where people often think I'm being too hard. But you have to understand, you can't perform surgery with a feather. You have to use a scalpel. You have to cut through the rot to get to the healthy tissue. Diane's denial was a thick, calloused rot, and I had to cut deep to get her to feel anything at all. Diane, I said, my voice softening just a bit, I'm not saying you're a monster. I'm saying you're a woman who is acting out of a deep, unhealed wound. You were ignored by your mother, so you decided you would never ignore your daughter. But you went to the other extreme. You became a helicopter parent who never landed. You've been hovering for 24 years, and the downwash from your blades is destroying everything Chloe is trying to build. You have to land the helicopter, Diane. You have to turn off the engine and step away. Are you capable of doing that? Or is the need to hover more powerful than the need to have a daughter who is alive and well? She looked up at me, her makeup streaked, her hair finally out of place. She looked at Chloe, who was waiting, hoping, I think, for a response that wasn't a defense. For a moment, the entire room held its breath. This was the one question moment. This was the point of no return. I don't know how to stop, Diane whispered. I don't know who I am if I'm not her mother. Well, that's the most honest thing you've said all day, I said. And it's the only place where we can actually start to build something new. But you have to understand, the version of mother you've been playing is dead. It's over. Chloe killed it 18 months ago when she changed her phone number. The only question now is whether you're willing to be a different kind of mother. A mother who listens more than she talks. A mother who respects a no as much as a yes. A mother who stays on her side of the fence. I turned to Chloe. Chloe, if she could actually do that, if she could go into intensive therapy, if she could learn to stay out of your business, if she could stop the smear campaign with the family, would there be a place for her in your life? Not tomorrow, not next week, but eventually. Chloe looked at her mother. She didn't answer right away. She was weighing the years of hurt against the possibility of a future. Maybe, she said finally, but I don't trust her. I haven't trusted her since I was 10 years old. Every time I give her an inch, she takes my whole life. I don't know if I can ever feel safe with her again. And that, I said, looking Diane dead in the eye, is the price of being right. You've won the argument, but you've lost the trust. And trust is a hell of a lot harder to build than a narrative. I leaned back, let that word trust hang in the air like a heavy fog. You can't buy trust, you can't demand it, and you certainly can't litigate it into existence. It's like a fine crystal vase. Once you smash it into 1,000 jagged pieces, you can glue it back together, but the cracks are always going to show. And if you keep smashing it over and over again, eventually there's nothing left but dust. Diane had spent years grinding that vase into the carpet, and now she was surprised she didn't have anything to put her flowers in. I looked at her, and I could see she was starting to realize the sheer scale of the reconstruction project ahead of her. It wasn't just about making an apology. It was about a total, fundamental restructuring of her own personality. Diane, I said, keeping my voice low, I want you to look at your daughter. Don't look at her as a problem to be solved. Don't look at her as a reflection of your parenting. Look at her as a 24-year-old woman who is standing in front of you, telling you that she is afraid of her own mother. Not afraid that you're going to hit her, but afraid that you're going to erase her. Do you hear the difference? Physical fear is one thing, but the fear of being psychologically consumed by another person, that's a different kind of terror. That's the kind of fear that makes people move 3 states away and change their names. That's the kind of fear that makes a daughter prefer the silence of a lonely apartment over the sound of her mother's voice. Diane looked at Chloe, and for the first time, her face didn't tighten with judgment, it slumped. The energy seemed to leak out of her. I never wanted her to be afraid of me, she whispered. I just wanted her to be safe. I thought if I knew where she was, if I knew what she was doing, I could protect her from the things that happened to me. And there it is, I said, the ghost in the nursery. You've been parenting the little girl you used to be, not the daughter you actually have. You were trying to protect young Diane from neglect, but in doing so, you were smothering adult Chloe. You were using her as a do-over for your own life. But Chloe isn't your second chance, Diane. She's her own first chance, and you've been robbing her of that every single day. You've been so busy being the bodyguard of her life that you forgot to be the mother of her heart. I turned to Chloe. Chloe, you said you don't trust her, and you shouldn't. Based on the data, based on the history, trusting her right now would be a mistake. She hasn't earned it. But what would it look like if she started the work? Not the "I'm sorry you feel that way" work, but the "I am going to get professional help to figure out why I am so terrified of letting you be an adult" work. What if she agreed to a structured, mediated communication plan where she doesn't get to ask you a single question about your life for 6 months, where all she does is listen to how you feel without defending herself? Chloe wiped her eyes. I don't think she can do it, Dr. Phil. I really don't. She'll agree to it here in front of the cameras because she wants to look good. But the second we're backstage or the second she gets home, she'll start the "I was just trying to help" routine again. She can't help herself. It's like a reflex for her. You're right, I said. It is a reflex. It's a maladaptive coping mechanism that's been baked into her brain since she was a child. And reflexes don't change because of a conversation. They change because of repetition and professional intervention. Diane, I'm going to make you an offer. I'm going to provide you with the best professional help available. I'm talking about intensive, one-on-one therapy with a specialist who deals with enmeshment and personality disorders. Not because I'm labeling you, but because you need a high-level coach to help you unlearn 24 years of toxic behavior. But here's the deal. If you miss one session, if you call Chloe's boss one more time, if you spread one more rumor to the family, the deal is off. And Chloe, you have my word, if she violates that, I will be the first one to tell you to walk away and never look back. I looked at Diane. Are you willing to surrender? Are you willing to admit that you are powerless over this compulsion to control her and that you need a higher level of accountability than just your own good intentions? Diane took a long, shaky breath. She looked at the floor, then at the audience, and finally at Chloe. I'll do it, she said. It wasn't the defiant "I'll do it" of earlier. It was the sound of a woman who had finally run out of places to hide. Okay, I said. But doing it means more than just showing up. It means when you're in that therapist's office and they tell you that you've been behaving like a predator, you don't get to walk out. You don't get to say they're unprofessional. You have to sit in that chair and take it. You have to own the fact that you've been a bully. Are you ready for that? Yes, she said, her voice barely audible. I turned back to Chloe. And for you, Chloe, the work is different. Your work is about building a life that is so solid, so grounded, that even if she tries to shake it, you don't fall down. It's about learning that you don't need her validation to be a whole person. You've been reacting to her for so long that you've forgotten how to just be. We're going to provide you with some support too, some boundary setting coaching, because you need to learn how to say no without feeling like you're killing her. You aren't responsible for her happiness, Chloe. You never were. That was a burden she placed on you before you could even walk, and it's time to put it down. Chloe's shoulders dropped about 2 inches. It was like she'd been carrying a literal weight on her back for a decade, and someone had finally unclipped the straps. That's the moment I live for. That's the breakthrough that actually matters. It's not the tears or the dramatic music, it's the physical release of a person realizing they are finally allowed to be free. But the story doesn't end on the stage. The stage is just the starting line. I've seen people have the most incredible realizations under the studio lights, only to go back to their old patterns the moment they hit the parking lot. The doctor, Phil effect is real, but it's not magic. It's an opportunity. And as we wrapped up that segment, I made sure Diane knew exactly how much was at stake. Diane, I said as the music started to swell for the break, you have a choice to make every single morning for the rest of your life. You can be a mother who has a daughter, or you can be a mother who is right. You've spent 24 years being right, and look where it got you. Try being wrong for a while. Try being quiet. Try being a student of your daughter's life instead of the director of it. It's going to be the hardest thing you've ever done. It's going to feel like you're disappearing. But I promise you, on the other side of that disappearance is the first real relationship you'll ever have. We walked off the stage, and I stayed with them for a few minutes in the hallway. The dynamic had changed. Usually, Diane would be trying to corner me, trying to get me to explain something to Chloe, or trying to fix her hair for the post-show photos. But she didn't. She stood about 3 feet away from Chloe, her hands clasped in front of her, looking like a guest in her own life. And Chloe was looking at her mother not with anger, but with a cautious, skeptical curiosity. It wasn't a hug. It wasn't a reconciliation. It was just a pause. And in a relationship as toxic as theirs had been, a pause is a miracle. Months later, I checked in with my team on Diane and Chloe's progress. It wasn't a fairy tale, because those don't exist in the real world of psychological recovery. Diane did go to the therapy sessions we provided. She struggled. She fired her first therapist, claiming they were biased. But to her credit, she went back. She eventually started to see that her need for control was a shield against her own deep-seated feelings of inadequacy. She began the slow, painful process of building a life that didn't revolve around her daughter's GPS coordinates. Chloe remained in the no-contact phase for several more months, and I supported that. She needed time for the static of her mother's voice to clear out of her head so she could hear her own thoughts. Last I heard, they had shared a brief coffee in a public place. There were no accusations, no tutoring, and no reorganized cabinets. Just 2 women trying to figure out if they could be strangers who happened to be related before they could ever try being mother and daughter again. Life isn't about being right, it's about being real. And sometimes being real means admitting the only thing you can truly control is you.